A time slip is a phenomenon that causes unexpected time travel, and the following three cases are classic examples of people encountering a time slip. The Running Man. The following incident took place in February 2019 in Leeds, UK, when James Fisher was in the city centre in a busy location close to Leeds Central Library and the Art Gallery. Fisher said that it was around midday and he was sitting on a bench with his son eating a sandwich. They were both watching people walking by as they were eating their sandwiches when a man dressed in a suit caught their attention. The man appeared to be about 50 years of age and he was running very fast whilst holding a drink. What amused them was that the man was running extremely fast in his smart suit while at the same time managing not to spill any of his drink while he was running. The man ran straight past them and then disappeared around a corner about 100 metres away. They then returned to eating their sandwiches, when about 2 seconds later, the same man in the same suit with his drink in hand was running at the same speed again past in front of them whilst they were sitting on their bench, exactly as he had done only seconds ago. He again passed in front of them and disappeared around the same corner as before. James Fisher said there was no way the man in the suit could have disappeared around the corner and then reappeared in front of them, given the amount of time that had elapsed, even if someone had driven him. Seeing the same man twice in about 2 seconds would have been impossible. Was James Fisher and his son caught in some strange time slip? The Soldiers. The following strange experience happened to David Dwyer from the UK in September 2020. Dwyer was near the town of Brockenhurst in the New Forest, Hampshire, in southern England. David had recently moved to Winchester a couple of weeks previously and was to start a short-term job. He only wanted a short-term job as he was waiting on a visa in order to leave the country. The day was pleasant and sunny, so David decided it would be a good time to take a walk. He used a phone app called New Forest Walks and chose a location called Buckland Rings, a journey that should have taken him about 3 to 4 hours to complete. David parked in the railway station car park and then proceeded to start his walk at a leisurely pace. As he was walking, he was admiring the beautiful scenery and an old church that he came upon. Occasionally, he would stop and chat with people that he passed and also stop to take some photographs. David had recently purchased a DSLR camera and wanted to familiarise himself with it before heading off overseas. After a couple of hours at around 1 p.m, he was feeling hungry and decided to eat and walked off of the main track until he came to a log to sit and eat his sandwiches. After lunch, he decided to walk back and took more photographs on the way. As he was walking, he noticed some movement in the trees to his left and quickly looked over and saw some soldiers jogging. The soldiers were spread over about 60 metres, moving across his path. They were dressed in old-fashioned khaki uniforms with tin hats that were covered in small branches and twigs and were carrying old-fashioned rifles. There was a man at the front that appeared to be the leader, who waved a pistol and was encouraging them as he blew a whistle. The group then moved across his path, but there were also some men behind him, and he suddenly realised that he was surrounded by noisome soldiers. But suddenly, as quickly as they arrived, they moved about 30 metres to his right and vanished. The incident happened so fast, he had no time to even take a snapshot of what he'd seen. David assumed that he'd been caught up in some military enactment where some people would dress up in old-style military clothing and guns and relive famous battle scenes. David completed his walk and arrived safely back at his car, and after arriving home, thought he'd do some research into who the men were who were playing war games. He emailed the New Forest Authority and made inquiries about the soldiers he'd encountered and who they were. The authority responded by telling him they had no idea who they were and suggested he contact the Brockenhurst College to seek further clarification on whether there were army cadets from their school playing war games in the forest, but they had no idea who it was and it was nothing to do with them. David was never able to find out who the soldiers were who appeared to be dressed as World War I servicemen and believes he was caught up in a time slip. It is interesting to note that the New Forest was used for large training exercises from the late 19th century through to the early 20th century. During hostilities, the New Forest played a significant role in World War I, so it appears that David Dwyer had been caught up in a time slip from the First World War. The Medieval Village. One Sunday morning in October 1957, three 15-year-old naval cadets, Michael Crowley, Ray Baker and William Lang, were taking part in a map-reading exercise where they were to navigate their way across 4 or 5 miles of countryside to a designated point and then return to base and report what they'd seen. The area they were meant to navigate was in a Suffolk village called Kersey in the southeast of England. As they were approaching the village, everything became silent and the sound of church bells suddenly ceased. As they looked around, the ducks in the pond stood quiet and motionless, and the birds stopped singing, and the wind had suddenly stopped blowing. As they passed some trees, the leaves were still, and there were no shadows being cast by the trees, and as they entered the actual village, the seasons seemed to change, where instead of autumnal weather, the appearance was that of early summer, where the trees were a magnificent green colour. They found the village deserted, and even though it was a Sunday morning, they expected to see at least one person. As they looked around, they could see no signs of modernity, such as cars parked by the side of the road, telephone poles or aerials on roofs. The houses on the main road looked ancient, with ragged timber frames. Everything looked medieval in appearance. The three young cadets then walked up to the nearest building that had a green painted door and windows with smallish glass panes, one at the front and one at the side, which were all grimy. They then pressed their faces against the windows and could see that it was a sort of butcher's shop, but there were no tables or a serving counter. They also spotted whole oxen carcasses that had been skinned but were looking green and mouldy in some places, as if they'd been hanging there for a long while. They just looked on in disbelief, as everything appeared unreal. They then walked to another house that also looked grubby with dirty windows, and again there were no signs of life. The walls had been roughly whitewashed, and the rooms had no furniture or other possessions and were totally empty. Nothing looked modern, and there were no signs of people anywhere, and by this stage they were genuinely spooked. They quickly turned and hurried out of the strange village onto a track that led to a small hill, and dared not turn back until they reached the top. It was at this point that they could hear the bells ringing again, and birds singing, and smoke rising from the chimneys in the village. Yet strangely, when they were in the village, there was no smoke coming from the chimneys. However, they continued moving away from the village in order to shake off their weird feeling. Many years later, the men realised that something very strange had happened to them, and they felt they had entered some kind of ghost village, and that they had somehow walked back in time. They also said that whilst they were in the village of Kersey, they had an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression. They also felt that there were unseen watchers, and what might have happened to them if they'd knocked on the door, and who would have answered, if anybody. It still frightened them thinking about it. The other strange fact was that before entering the village, it was autumn, but as they walked into the village, the trees had their summer leaves. Even though it was 1957, it seems that the young cadets had walked through the town of Kersey as it had been centuries before. On further research, the first building they encountered that looked like a butcher's shop in 1957 was a private residence, but records showed that from about 1350 up until 1790 had actually been a butcher's shop. Another strange occurrence was that as they were approaching the village, they could hear church bells ringing, but abruptly stopped when they reached the village, where there was no sign of a church. Historical records showed that St Mary's Church in Kersey dated back to the 14th century and was a principal landmark. Had the cadets entered the village sometime before the 14th century? However, the construction of the church had been suspended because of the dreaded Black Death between 1348 and 1390, which killed half the population of Kersey, so maybe the cadets had come upon the village after the plague had struck, where the half-constructed church was hidden by trees. In summing up, what the cadets encountered appears to be a classic case of a time slip, where everything became deathly still and quiet with no signs of people, and the feeling of sadness and depression which people often feel when encountering a time slip.